When a lonely billionaire starts receiving handwritten letters from a kind stranger, he discovers the life-changing power of words. But when their worlds collide, can love bridge the gap between privilege and authenticity? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Nicholas Whitmore had everything money could buy, but something was missing in his life. At 45 years old, he lived in a mansion overlooking the city, drove expensive cars, and ran one of the biggest companies in town. But at night, when he sat alone in his huge living room, he felt empty inside. Another boring charity event, Nick said to himself as he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror. His housekeeper, Maria, had laid out his best suit for the evening's foundation dinner. These events were always the same, rich people pretending to care about causes while showing off their wealth. But there was one thing that made Nick's life different these days: the letters. For the past year, someone had been sending him beautiful handwritten letters, signed only as EV. These weren't love letters or fan mail. They were thoughtful messages about life, about finding meaning, about being a better person. Sometimes, they included quotes from books or observations about the changing seasons. Nick found himself looking forward to them more than anything else in his life. "Sir, your car is ready," his driver announced through the intercom. Nick grabbed his jacket and headed downstairs, but not before checking his mail one last time. There it was, another cream-colored envelope with the familiar handwriting. He smiled and put it in his pocket to read later, when he needed a break from all the fake smiles at the party. At the other end of town, in the modest public library, Evangeline Porter was finishing up her workday. At 38, she had spent the last decade working as a librarian, helping people find books and organizing community programs. She loved her job, even though some people looked right through her, as if a black woman in sensible shoes couldn't possibly have anything important to say. Evie, as her friends called her, had started writing to Nick Whitmore by accident. She had found his business card in a donated book and, moved by a news story about his lonely childhood, decided to send him a note about finding happiness in simple things. She never expected him to mention in a TV interview how much he appreciated getting thoughtful letters from someone who seemed to understand him. Miss Porter. Janet, the junior librarian, interrupted her thoughts. "This came for you." She handed Evie an elegant invitation to the Whitmore Foundation Gala. Evie's heart skipped a beat. She had never planned to meet Nick in person. That wasn't the point of the letters. But something made her want to see him just once, to know if the man who read her letters with such appreciation was real. "I'll go," she said softly, surprising herself. The next few days passed in a blur. Evie spent her savings on a simple but elegant dark blue dress. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, she told herself. She just didn't want to stand out for the wrong reasons. The night of the gala arrived, and Evie felt like she was stepping into another world. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and fine china. Women in designer dresses floated around, their jewelry catching the light. Men in expensive suits gathered in groups, talking about business deals and golf games. Evie found a quiet spot near the punch bowl, watching everyone. She saw Nick as soon as he walked in, tall, handsome, and completely at ease. He moved from group to group, shaking hands and laughing. This was his world, and he ruled it like a king. Then it happened. Nick noticed her standing alone and walked over, but not with kindness in his eyes. He had a smirk on his face that Evie had seen before, on people who thought they were better than others. "Well," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "I don't remember seeing you at these events before. Did you come with the catering staff?" The people around them laughed, and Evie felt her face grow hot. Without a word, she put down her glass and walked toward the exit, her heart breaking not just for herself, but for the man she thought she had come to know through their letters. In her purse was the letter she had planned to give him in person. Now she knew better. The real Nicholas Whitmore wasn't the thoughtful man who read her letters. He was just another rich man who looked down on people like her. That night, Evie sat at her desk at home and wrote one last letter. This time she wrote about what she had seen at the party, about how money and power meant nothing if you didn't have kindness in your heart, about how disappointed she was to meet the real Nicholas Whitmore. She sealed the envelope, knowing this would be the last time she wrote to him. Some dreams, she realized, were better left as dreams. Nick sat in his office the morning after the gala, feeling pleased with himself. These events always went the same way. He'd make his appearance, charm the right people, and secure more business deals. But when his secretary brought in the mail, everything changed. There it was, another letter from Evie. But this one was different. As soon as he started reading, his smile disappeared. "Last night I saw the real you," the letter began. "I watched as you humiliated a woman simply because you thought she didn't belong in your world. I've spent a year writing to you about kindness and understanding, but now I see those letters were wasted." Nick's hands started shaking. The letter went on to describe exactly what he had said at the gala, how he had acted, how people had laughed. Evie had been there. Evie had seen everything. "Nancy," he called out to his secretary, "get my investigator on the phone now." Within hours, Nick had his best private investigator working to find out who Evie was. He couldn't explain why, but he needed to know. These letters had become the most real thing in his life, and now he was losing them. 2 days later, the investigator walked into his office with a file. "Her name is Evangeline Porter. She works at the public library downtown. She's 38, single, well-educated, but not wealthy. And yes, she was at your gala." Nick stared at the photo in the file. It was her, the woman he had humiliated. The woman whose letters had touched his heart was the same one he had treated like she was nothing. "Oh God," he whispered, remembering his cruel words. "What have I done?" That afternoon, Nick drove to the library. He parked his expensive car around the corner, not wanting to draw attention. Through the window, he could see Evie helping an elderly woman find a book. She smiled warmly, took her time, treated the woman with respect, everything he hadn't done at the gala. "I have to make this right," he said to himself. But how do you apologize for showing the worst of yourself to someone who had seen the best in you? He started small. The next day, he had his assistant deliver a huge donation of new books to the library. The day after that, he donated computers for the children's section. But he made sure his name wasn't on anything. He wasn't doing this for recognition. Evie wasn't fooled. She knew these anonymous donations were from Nick. It was too much of a coincidence. "If he thinks he can buy forgiveness, he doesn't understand anything," she told her co-worker Janet. Finally, after a week of donations, Nick worked up the courage to go into the library himself. Evie was at the front desk when he walked in. She looked up, saw him, and her face went cold. "Miss Porter," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you." "Mr. Whitmore, this is a library. People come here to read, not talk," she replied, her voice firm but professional. "Then let me check out a book," he said, not giving up. "What would you recommend for someone who needs to learn about humility?" For the first time, Evie looked directly at him. "Pride and Prejudice," she said after a moment. "It's about a man who learns that his pride has cost him the love of someone who saw the real him." Nick took the book, their fingers brushing briefly as she handed it to him. He felt a jolt of electricity at the touch, but Evie pulled her hand back quickly. "Evie," he said softly, "I know it was you. I know you're Evie, and I need you to know how sorry I am." "Sorry because you were cruel, or sorry because you found out who I am?" she asked. Before Nick could answer, a group of children came running up to the desk, excited about story time. Evie turned her attention to them, effectively dismissing him. Nick left the library with the book, but he knew this was just the beginning. He had spent his whole life thinking he was better than others because of his money. Now he had hurt the one person who had seen past all that, who had written to him about real things, important things. That night he sat down and wrote his first letter to her. It wasn't elegant like her letters had been. It was messy and honest and full of regret. He wrote about growing up thinking money made him special, about how empty his life felt despite his success, about how her letters had been the only real thing in his world. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he wrote at the end. "But please, don't stop believing that people can change. Your letters changed me, even if I didn't show it that night. Give me a chance to prove it." He dropped the letter off at the library the next morning, leaving it on her desk before the library opened. Now all he could do was wait. and hoped that the woman who had written to him for a year would give him one more chance to show her who he could really be. For 2 weeks straight, Nick showed up at the library every day. He didn't try to talk to Evie again, but instead sat quietly and read. Sometimes he helped elderly patrons reach books on high shelves. Other times he just watched how Evie worked, her patience, her kindness, her quiet strength. "He's still here," Janet whispered to Evie one afternoon. "That's the same man who made fun of you at the party?" "People aren't always what they seem," Evie replied, thinking about the letters she'd written him, about the man she thought she knew. Nick had read her letter about Pride and Prejudice 3 times now. He started seeing himself in Mr. Darcy, a rich man who had to learn that money wasn't everything. But unlike in the book, he wasn't sure he would get a happy ending. One rainy Tuesday, Nick noticed an old woman struggling with a stack of heavy books. Before Evie could get there, he rushed to help. "Let me carry those to your car," he offered. The woman smiled. "Such a nice young man. You remind me of my late husband. He used to volunteer here too." Nick stopped. "I'm not a volunteer. I'm just..." He didn't know how to finish that sentence. Later that day, he went to the library director's office. "I'd like to volunteer here officially," he said. "Whatever you need, shelving books, helping with programs, anything." Word spread quickly through the library staff. Nicholas Whitmore, the millionaire businessman, was going to volunteer at their small library. Some people thought he was crazy. Others thought it was just for show. Evie didn't know what to think. She had read his letter, the one he'd left, on her desk. It was different from any other letter she'd seen from him. It was messy, with crossed-out words and ink smudges. It felt real. "Why are you really here?" she finally asked him one quiet afternoon. "Because I need to learn what you've been trying to teach me all along," he answered honestly. "About seeing people for who they are, not what they have." That night, Evie sat at her desk at home, looking at all the letters she'd kept from Nick, his responses to her letters over the past year. She could see now that he had been changing slowly, even before he knew who she was. But was it enough? The next morning, Nick's brother James stormed into the library. "Have you lost your mind?" he shouted, not caring about the quiet library rules. "The board is talking about removing you as CEO. You're spending all your time in this place instead of running the company." Everyone stared, including Evie. Nick stood up calmly. "Lower your voice, James. This is a library." "You need to end whatever this is," James demanded. "Come back to reality. This isn't your world." Nick looked around the library, at the children, reading, the elderly couples sharing newspapers, the students studying. Then he looked at Evie, who was watching everything with concern in her eyes. "You're wrong," Nick said to his brother. "This is exactly where I need to be." After James left, Evie found Nick in the poetry section, his hands shaking slightly as he reshelved books. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied. "For the first time in my life, I'm doing something that matters." That evening, as Evie was locking up, she found a new letter from Nick on her desk. Inside was an invitation, not to a fancy restaurant or expensive event, but to help him run the children's reading program. He wanted to start at the library. "I can't change who I was," he had written, "but I can change who I'm becoming. Will you help?" "Me?" Evie held the letter close. She thought about how far they'd both come, her from the woman who wrote anonymous letters, him from the man who cared only about appearances. Maybe change was possible after all. She took out a piece of paper and began to write, "Dear Nick." The children's reading program was set to start on a Wednesday afternoon. Nick had spent weeks preparing, working with Evie to choose books and create activities. But that morning, his assistant rushed into the library with bad news. "The board called an emergency meeting," she said, out of breath. "They're voting on your position today." Nick looked at the classroom they had set up for the children. Colorful posters covered the walls. Small chairs were arranged in a circle. Everything was ready. "Tell them I'll be there after the reading program," he said firmly. His assistant's eyes widened. "But Mr. Whitmore, they're threatening to remove you as CEO." "Some things are more important," Nick replied, straightening the name tags on the little chairs. Evie overheard everything. She felt torn. She didn't want Nick to lose his company, but seeing him choose the children over his business made her heart skip a beat. The first group of kids arrived at 3 p.m. sharp. They were from the local shelter, children who didn't have many books at home. Nick sat in a child-sized chair looking completely out of place in his expensive suit, but his smile was genuine. "Today," he began, "we're going to read about a very special bear who loves honey." Evie watched from the doorway as Nick read Winnie the Pooh, doing different voices for each character. The children were captivated. This was a different Nick from the man she'd met at the gala. This man was real, warm, human. Meanwhile, across town, James Whitmore walked into the board meeting with a thick folder. "My brother has lost his mind," he announced to the room, full of executives. "He's spending his days reading children's books instead of running this company. I move to have him temporarily removed as CEO." Back at the library, Nick was helping a little girl sound out words when his phone buzzed. Message after message poured in. The board had voted. He was suspended as CEO pending further review. "Mr. Nick," the little girl tugged at his sleeve. "Why are you crying?" Nick quickly wiped his eyes. "I'm not crying, sweetheart. I just got something in my eye. Now let's figure out this word together." Evie couldn't stand by anymore. During the snack break, she pulled Nick aside. "You should go to that meeting, fight for your company." Nick shook his head. "For the first time in my life, I'm doing something that matters, really matters. But your company is just money and power," Nick finished. "I had all that before and I was miserable. These kids, this program, you..." He paused, looking into her eyes. "This is what I want my life to be about now." That evening, after all the children had gone home, Nick and Evie sat surrounded by scattered books and cookie crumbs. Nick's phone kept ringing with calls from the board, from his lawyers, from his brother. He ignored them all. "Why did you really start writing to me?" he asked Evie suddenly. She was quiet for a moment. "I saw something in your eyes during a TV interview. Loneliness. The same kind I felt every day. I thought maybe if someone reached out..." "You saved me," Nick said softly. "Those letters, they were the first real thing in my life." Before Evie could respond, James burst into the library, waving papers. "Congratulations, brother. You just lost everything. The board voted unanimously. You're out." Nick stood up slowly. "No, James. For the first time in my life, I've found everything that matters." James looked between Nick and Evie, realization dawning on his face. "Don't tell me you're choosing this librarian over your family legacy?" "Her name is Evie," Nick said firmly. "And yes, I choose this life. I choose being real over being rich." After James stormed out, Evie touched Nick's arm gently. "You don't have to give up everything for this." Nick turned to her, his eyes full of certainty. "I'm not giving up anything. I'm finally finding out who I really am." That night, they both wrote letters, Nick to the board, resigning permanently as CEO, and Evie to Nick, finally opening her heart completely to the man he had become, the EU. News spread fast. "Whitmore heir gives up fortune for library." Love. The newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. Reporters camped outside the library, trying to get photos of Nick and Evie together. "This is all my fault," Evie said one morning, watching photographers gather outside. "Your whole life is falling apart because of me." Nick was shelving books nearby. He'd sold his mansion and moved into a simple apartment downtown. His expensive suits were replaced with casual clothes. "My life isn't falling apart," he said. "It's finally coming together." But trouble was brewing. James Whitmore wasn't done fighting. He called an emergency family meeting at their mother's estate. "Nicholas," his mother Eleanor said, sitting in her expensive armchair, "this has gone on long enough. First the company, now I hear you've sold the house. And all for some librarian?" "Her name is Evie, Mother," Nick replied calmly. "And she's taught me more about life than all our money ever did." Eleanor's face hardened. "If you continue this foolishness, I'll have no choice. The family trust will go to James." "Go ahead," Nick said, standing up. "I don't want it." Back at the library, Evie was having her own battles. Anonymous complaints had been filed about her relationship with a library donor. The library board was concerned about appearances. "Maybe we should stop seeing each other," Evie told Nick that evening. You've lost so much already. I can't let you lose everything. Nick took her hand. I haven't lost anything that matters. Money, status, that was all just pretend. This is real. But James wasn't finished. He hired private investigators to dig into Evie's past, looking for anything to discredit her. What they found shocked everyone. Did you know? James confronted Evie at the library. Did you know that 20 years ago your father worked as a janitor at Whitmore Industries? That he was fired when the company downsized? Evie's face went pale. That was a long time ago. Is that what this is about? James sneered. Revenge? Nick stepped between them. Get out, James, now! That night, Evie told Nick everything. How her father had lost his job, how they'd struggled, how she'd put herself through school working 3 jobs. But that's not why I wrote to you, she said, tears in her eyes. I swear. Nick held her close. I know. You wrote to me because you saw someone who needed help, just like you help everyone who comes into this library. The next day, Nick made a decision. He called a press conference outside the library. Reporters gathered, expecting another scandal. My whole life, Nick began, I thought being a Whitmore meant being better than everyone else, but I was wrong. True worth isn't in a bank account or a family name. It's in how we treat others, how we love. He turned to Evie, who stood nervously nearby. This woman wrote letters to a stranger because she saw he was lonely. She runs programs for children who need a safe place to learn. She helps elderly people find books that make them feel less alone. That's real wealth. The cameras flashed as Nick took Evie's hand. I'm not giving up my fortune for love. I'm finding out what real fortune is. Eleanor Whitmore watched the press conference on TV, her hand trembling as she held her teacup. For the first time, she saw her son, really saw him, not as the Whitmore heir, but as a man who had finally found his way. That evening, Evie found a letter on her desk. But this time it wasn't from Nick, it was from Eleanor Whitmore asking to meet for tea. Perhaps, the letter said, it's time for me to learn what my son has learned about what really matters in life. The Whitmore family's favorite tea room was exactly as elegant as Evie had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and fine china clinked softly as wealthy women gossiped over expensive tea. Eleanor Whitmore sat straight-backed at her usual table, watching Evie approach. Miss Porter, she said coolly, thank you for coming. Mrs. Whitmore, Evie replied, sitting down carefully. She felt out of place in her simple dress. I'll be direct, Eleanor said. What do you want from my son? Nothing, Mrs. Whitmore. I never wanted anything from Nick except for him to be happy. Eleanor studied her face. You know, I was poor once too, before I married Nicholas's father. I worked as a secretary. This surprised Evie. Nick never mentioned that. Because he doesn't know, Eleanor said sharply. I worked very hard to forget that part of my life, to become the perfect Whitmore wife. A waiter brought tea and Eleanor poured with practiced grace. But watching my son these past weeks, he's different, happier, like the little boy he used to be, before his father taught him that Whitmores don't show emotion. Meanwhile, Nick was dealing with his own crisis. James had called another board meeting, this time with proof that Nick had been secretly funding the library's programs with company money. It was my personal account, Nick argued, which was tied to company funds, James shot back. This could mean criminal charges, Nick. Back at the tea room, Eleanor was still talking. I've spent 40 years teaching my sons that image is everything, that we're better than ordinary people. But look what it's done to them. James is bitter and angry, and Nicholas was miserable. Until what? Evie asked softly. Until your letters, Eleanor admitted. I found them, you know, in his study after he moved out. I read them all. Tears formed in Eleanor's eyes. You saw my son, not the Whitmore heir, not the CEO, just Nicholas. The moment was interrupted by Nick bursting into the tea room, ignoring the shocked stares of other patrons. Evie, we have a problem. James is pressing charges over the library funding. Eleanor's teacup crashed to the floor. He's doing what? Mother, I'm sorry, but no. Eleanor stood up, her voice firm. I've stood by while this family tore itself apart over money and image. No more. She turned to Evie. You love my son? Yes, Evie said without hesitation. The real him. Eleanor nodded. Then it's time I remembered who I really am too. She pulled out her phone. James, get to my house immediately and bring those papers you're planning to file. That evening, the Whitmore family gathered in Eleanor's living room. James paced angrily while Eleanor sat calmly, Evie's letters spread out on the coffee table. Mother, you don't understand, James began. No, you don't understand, Eleanor cut him off. I've read these letters. This woman didn't want our money or our name. She wanted your brother to find happiness. Real happiness. Something I forgot existed when I married into this family. She picked up one of the letters. And Nicholas, he found it. Now you have a choice, James. Drop this vendetta, or I'll tell. The board who really authorized those questionable overseas accounts last year. James went pale. You wouldn't. Try me, Eleanor said. I'm not just a Whitmore wife anymore. I'm a mother who's finally doing right by her son. After James left, Eleanor turned to Nick and Evie. Now then, about this children's reading program, I believe it needs proper funding, and as it happens, I have my own trust fund that's been gathering dust. For the first time in years, Nick saw his mother smile, really smile, and as he held Evie's hand, he realized that sometimes losing everything was the only way to find what you really needed. Eleanor Whitmore's past as a secretary became the talk of the town. Old photos surfaced in the newspapers showing a young Eleanor working at a desk, looking just like any other working girl from that era. Mother, why didn't you ever tell us? Nick asked as they sorted through children's books at the library. Eleanor shelved a copy of Cinderella with a sad smile. Because I was ashamed. Your father made me feel that my past wasn't good enough for the Whitmore name. But now, Eleanor was everywhere at the library. She joined the reading program, sharing stories about her own childhood in a small town. The children loved her, especially when she did different voices for each character. James, however, wasn't finished. He discovered that the library building's lease was up for renewal, and the property owner was his old golf buddy. Your little library project is about to become homeless, he told Nick with a smirk. The owner's selling to developers. The news hit the community hard. Parents worried about where their children would go after school. Elderly patrons who walked to the library every day were devastated. We can't let this happen, Evie said during an emergency staff meeting. This library is more than just books. It's a home for so many people. Nick had an idea. What if we buy the building? We don't have that kind of money, Evie reminded him. No, Eleanor spoke up from the doorway. But I do. She walked in, holding a folder. I've kept my inheritance from my parents separate from the Whitmore money all these years. I never touched it, because Howard said it wasn't proper money. James burst into the meeting. Mother, you can't be serious. That money is your security. No, Eleanor said firmly. These people are my security. This place, these books, these children, they've given me back who I really am. But James had one last card to play. He pulled out his phone and showed them all a news article. Look who else is interested in the building. Dad's old company, Morrison Industries. They're offering 3 times the market value. Nick felt his heart sink. No one could outbid Morrison Industries, not even with his mother's money. That's when Evie stood up. Then we'll fight differently. Not with money, but with stories. She organized a community meeting right there in the library. People came from all over town to share what the library meant to them. A teenage girl spoke about how the library had been her safe haven when she was homeless. An elderly man talked about meeting his late wife in the poetry section 50 years ago. Children drew pictures of their favorite reading spots. Local news stations picked up the story. Community fights to save historic library became the headline everywhere. Eleanor watched it all with tears in her eyes. This is what real wealth looks like, she told Nick. Not our bank accounts or our family name, but this. Suddenly, James walked in, looking uncomfortable. The Morrison Industries CEO is here. He wants to talk to all of you. The CEO, an older man named George Morrison, entered the library. He looked around slowly, taking everything in. You know, he said finally, I met my wife in this library, too. Right over there in the mystery section, she was reading Agatha Christie. He turned to face everyone. I didn't know what this place meant to the community. The deal is off. Some things are worth more than money. The room erupted in cheers. James stood in the corner, watching his mother hug Evie, watching his brother smile bigger than he had in years. That night, Eleanor sat down and wrote her own letter, addressed to both Nick and Evie. "Thank you," she wrote, "for helping me remember who I was before I became Mrs. Whitmore. Some of us spend our whole lives trying to be something we're not, only to discover that who we really are was good enough all along." James Whitmore stood alone in his office, staring at old family photos. The victory at the library had made front-page news, but something else caught his eye. A small article about a youth center closing in their old neighborhood. "I remember that place," he muttered, picking up his phone to call Nick. At the library, Nick was surprised to see his brother's name on the caller ID. "James? Remember where Dad used to drop us off when he and Mom had charity events?" Nick sat down. "The downtown youth center. They helped us with homework while Dad worked late." "It's closing," James said, "unless someone helps." Nick heard something different in his brother's voice. "What are you thinking? Maybe we've been wrong about everything, about what the Whitmore name should mean." The next day, James walked into the library, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes. Evie watched as he approached a group of kids struggling with math homework. "Need help?" he asked awkwardly. "I used to be good at numbers." Eleanor found them an hour later, James surrounded by children, patiently explaining fractions. She saw something she hadn't seen in years, her eldest son smiling. That evening, James called a family meeting at the library. "I want to use my share of the company to start something new, a foundation, not for show but for real change." "What kind of change?" Nick asked cautiously. "Education centers, like this library but in neighborhoods that need them, starting with the downtown youth center." Evie spoke up. "Those neighborhoods need more than just buildings. They need people who care." "I know," James said quietly. "That's why I'm stepping down as CEO. The company, it's not what I want anymore." Eleanor reached for her son's hand. "Your father would have called this foolish." "Dad was wrong about a lot of things," James replied. "I see that now." The next few weeks brought big changes. James worked alongside Nick and Evie, learning about community programs. He traded his designer suits for jeans, his corner office for a desk at the library. "You know what's funny?" he told Nick one day. "I spent years fighting to be the perfect Whitmore. Turns out the best thing a Whitmore can do is stop trying to be perfect." The local paper ran a new story. "Whitmore Brothers Unite to Save Youth Center." This time the photos showed both brothers reading to children, Eleanor helping with art projects, and Evie directing it all with a proud smile. "We're not doing this for publicity," James told a reporter. "We're doing it because everyone deserves a place where they belong." Nick found Evie in the poetry section that evening. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For writing those letters. For changing not just my life, but my whole family's." Evie smiled. "Sometimes love isn't just about two people. Sometimes it changes everything around it too." A year had passed since Nick first walked into the library. The Whitmore Education Foundation now had 5 centers across the city, but something was still missing. Nick found the old letters in his apartment, every one Evie had written to him. He traced her handwriting with his finger, remembering how they had changed his life. "I need your help," he told his mother over coffee. "I want to do something special for Evie." Eleanor smiled. "I think I know just the thing." They worked in secret for weeks. James helped too, surprising everyone with his attention to detail. The library staff kept Evie busy with a fake inventory project while they prepared. On a quiet Sunday morning, Evie arrived at the library to find it transformed. Books created paths through the aisles, their spines telling a story. Their story. She followed the trail of books, each one carefully chosen. Pride and Prejudice, where their real story began. Winnie the Pooh from their first reading program. Every book held a memory. At the end of the trail, in the poetry section where she used to hide and write her letters, stood Nick. Behind him, their families and the entire library community waited quietly. "Evie," Nick said, his voice shaking. "I used to think I had everything. Money, power, status. But I had nothing until I got your first letter." He pulled out a worn envelope. "This was the first time someone saw me, really saw me. Not as a Whitmore, but as Nick. Just Nick." Evie felt tears forming as Nick continued. You taught me that real love isn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It's about seeing someone's heart and writing to it, even when you're afraid they might not write back. He got down on one knee, holding not a ring, but a book. Inside was a letter, and nestled in its pages, a simple diamond ring. I'm not asking you to marry Nicholas Whitmore, businessman and heir. I'm asking you to marry Nick, the man who learned to love books, children, and simple truths because of you. Will you marry me? Before Evie could answer, James stepped forward. Wait, there's something else. He handed Evie an envelope. Inside were papers showing that the library and all 5 education centers had been put in a trust. No one can ever take them away, James explained. They belong to the community now, forever. Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. This is what the Whitmore name should have meant all along. Evie looked at the papers, then at Nick, still kneeling, and finally at all the faces watching, children from their reading programs, elderly patrons who'd become friends, staff who'd become family. Yes, she said softly, then louder. Yes. The library erupted in cheers. As Nick slipped the ring on her finger, Evie noticed it was engraved. On the inside were 2 simple letters. E.V. The letters that changed everything, Nick whispered. That night, after everyone had gone home, Nick and Evie sat in their usual spot in the poetry section. You know, Evie said, I never told you why I really wrote that first letter. Why? Because when I saw you on TV that day, you looked exactly like I felt, surrounded by people but completely alone. I thought maybe we could be alone together, Nick. Pulled her close. We'll never be alone again, either of us. The library was decorated with thousands of books arranged like flowers. It wasn't a typical wedding venue, but for Nick and Evie it was perfect. Eleanor had insisted on helping with the planning, but kept it simple. No society photographers, she said firmly. This is about family, not headlines. James stood as best man, holding a letter, the last one Evie had written to Nick before they met. He read it during the ceremony. Dear Nick, sometimes the richest people are the poorest in spirit, and sometimes the quietest voices speak the loudest truths. Maybe one day you'll understand that true worth isn't in what you own, but in what you give. Evie wore a simple white dress holding a bouquet made of paper flowers crafted from old book pages. Nick waited for her between the stacks where they'd first met, tears in his eyes as she walked toward him. The library community filled the rows, children from their reading programs, elderly patrons, staff members. In the front row, a photo of Evie's father sat next to Eleanor, bringing both families together. When I first came to this library, Nick said in his vows, I thought I was someone important, but you showed me what real importance means. It's not about being at the top of the world, it's about lifting others up with you. Evie's vows were simple. You asked me once why I wrote those letters. Here's my last letter to you. I love you not because of who you were or who you've become, but because you had the courage to change. After the ceremony, James made an announcement. The Whitmore Education Foundation was expanding nationwide. My brother and Evie taught me that real legacy isn't about preserving wealth, it's about enriching lives. Eleanor stood up next. And I have an announcement too. I'm going back to school to become a librarian. The celebration lasted into the night. Children ran through the aisles playing hide and seek. Elderly couples danced between the bookshelves. The library, once just a building full of books, had become the heart of a real community. Late that evening, Nick found Evie in their spot in the poetry section. Happy? He asked. More than that, she replied. Grateful. For what? For a lost business card in a donated book. For the courage to write to a stranger. For second chances and new beginnings. Nick pulled out one last surprise. A leather-bound book containing all their letters. On the first page he'd written, The greatest stories aren't always in books. Sometimes they're in the letters we dare to write, the changes we dare to make, and the love we dare to believe in. Evie touched the book gently. Our story. Just the first chapter, Nick said, holding her close. We have so many more to write. In the quiet of the library, surrounded by thousands of stories on shelves, Nick and Evie began their own next chapter. Not as a rich man and a librarian, not as a Whitmore and a Porter, but as two people who found each other through words, grew through understanding, and built a love story that changed not just their lives, but their entire world. The end.